The air itself was a physical presence, a dense, shimmering thing woven from heat and pulverized sandstone. It pressed against the young boy, Elias, with the demanding, relentless force of a blacksmith's hammer resting squarely on his skull. 11 years old, yet bearing the weary gait of decades, he traversed the waste of Ashkalan, a landscape utterly devoid of compromise, stretching out in waves of ochre and desiccated clay towards a horizon that promised nothing but more heat and the eventual inevitable descent of a sun that seemed determined to incinerate the very notion of shade. Elias was hunting scrap, not for leisure, but for survival. His ragged cotton tunic, once white, now held the pervasive, ingrained color of the desert itself, a pale, dirty salmon, and clung damply to his thin shoulders, releasing a faint, salty smell into the furnace of the surrounding air. Every inhale was a negotiation with the dust, a dry, metallic flavor coating the back of his throat. Thirst was not an emotion. It was a permanent state of being, a tight cord drawn across his larynx. He dragged a salvaged magnet, tied precariously to the end of a frayed length of rope across the undulating dunes. The magnet was weak, capable only of attracting the smallest, most superficial fragments of discarded metal, a bottle cap, a bent nail, a shard of wiring left decades ago by some forgotten exploration. These small, meager findings were traded at the edge of the settlement, Oasis's shadow, for a cup of thin, sour milk or a handful of hard-baked grain. They were the buffer between hunger and the complete annihilating emptiness that characterized his life. His gaze was fixed downward, a practiced habit of survival. He scanned the striated patterns of the sand, searching for any anomaly, a glint of oxidized copper, the unnatural flatness of an industrial edge. The sun, now nearing its apex, created confusing optical illusions, turning every pebble into a potential treasure and every shadow into a fleeting respite. He had walked this particular expanse, known locally as the Crucible of Sighs, for nearly 3 hours, the silence broken only by the abrasive whisper of the wind shuffling the top layer of grit. His desperation was mounting. The previous 2 days had yielded almost nothing, and the gnawing sensation in his stomach had progressed from annoyance to a dull, heavy insistence. He pressed his dry lips together, trying to summon enough moisture to wet the cracked corners. It was not a magnetic pull that alerted him, but a visible rupture in the perfect geometric flow of the sand's surface. A small, dark shape, half buried, offered a defiant resistance to the wind's shaping hands. It was denser than the brittle shale typical of this area. Elias stopped abruptly, the cessation of movement throwing his body's inertia forward slightly. He dropped the magnet and crouched, the loose, hot sand immediately scalding the skin of his knees through the thin fabric of his trousers. The object was tiny, barely the length of his hand, and seemed to be made of some dark, heavy metal that defied the desert's typical propensity for rapid oxidation. He reached out a trembling hand, the movement slow and deliberate, fearing it might be a mirage or some dangerous, stinging insect. His fingers, thin and calloused, brushed against the exposed surface. It was cool to the touch, unnaturally so, absorbing the intense heat rather than reflecting it. He began to dig with the frantic, clawing efficiency born of absolute need. Using the edges of his hands as rudimentary shovels, he swept the fine grit away, revealing more of the object. The sand offered little resistance, flowing like water around his wrists. Slowly, meticulously, the form took shape. It was not a piece of scrap. It was a key unlike any Elias had ever seen or even imagined. It was forged from a metal the color of aged hematite, nearly black, with a faint iridescent sheen where the sun struck the polished facets. It was heavy, possessing a significant, almost unsettling density that felt ancient and deliberate in his palm. The handle was not a typical loop. but a complicated geometry of interlocking, spiraling loops that seemed to mimic the shape of a dried nautilus shell, intricately detailed without being decorative. It felt functional, serious. The bit of the key, the cutting edge intended for the lock, was even more perplexing. It was vast and complex, a series of intricately layered asymmetrical teeth and serrations, rising in varying heights and depths. It did not look designed to open a simple padlock or a chest. It looked designed to resolve an equation. Elias stared at it, the intensity of his confusion momentarily overriding his exhaustion. Why would such an object be here, in the dead center of nowhere, far beyond the furthest crumbled foundations of Oasis's shadow? The desert was not a keeper of secrets. It was a destroyer. It swallowed all history, pulverized all relics, and reduced meaning to sand. He gripped the key tightly, the metal immediately warming from the transfer of his body heat. The sensation was profoundly grounding. It was a massive, undeniable fact in a world built on ephemeral suffering. A strange, involuntary tremor ran down his spine. It was not fear yet, but the sharp, shocking realization that this object possessed a gravity that might alter the orbit of his isolated life. This was not scrap. This was not food. This was a premise. He lifted the key, holding it up against the blinding blue of the sky. The sunlight caught the dark metal, illuminating faint hairline engravings along the shank, symbols or script he did not recognize, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse subtly, demanding attention. The urge to dismiss it as a piece of discarded ritualistic junk, perhaps an old ceremonial weight, was strong, fueled by a lifetime of desert disillusionment. But the weight, the sheer, perfect engineering of the object, rejected that cynical explanation. A new urgency seized him, displacing the hunger. If this key existed, then logically, something must exist for it to open. The concept was irrefutable, a foundational law of object permanence. He lowered the key and looked around the vast, circular expanse of the horizon. Where in this endless, featureless furnace could something worthy of this solemn, heavy key be hidden? The desert offered no clue. Every dune looked identical, every patch of scrub seemed arranged by the same chaotic hand. He closed his eyes, pressing the complex helix of the key's grip against his palm. He needed to find a reference point, an anomaly, a break in the pattern. He tried to recall the landscape immediately surrounding the spot where he found the key. It was a depression, a shallow trough that ran parallel to a barely perceptible ridge of harder, packed clay. This ridge was old, very old, surviving erosion better than the surrounding fine sand. He had always avoided walking on it. The walking was harder. Elias reopened his eyes and focused on that ridge, tracing its trajectory eastward. It ran like a skeletal finger pointed towards the rising sun, an ancient fault line in the geological tapestry. If something massive and immovable were buried here, it would likely be situated along the line of greatest subsurface stability. The thought, rational and cold, brought a rush of adrenaline that briefly anesthetized his exhaustion. He had to follow the ridge. He placed the key securely inside the front pocket of his tunic, resting directly over his heart. Its solid weight was a strange comfort and a terrifying responsibility. The rhythm of his movement changed. He was no longer meandering for sustenance. He was pursuing a defined, unknown destination. The sun hammered down harder, amplifying the desert's dramatic warning. The air tasted of metal and dust, and the silence seemed to magnify the frantic thumping of his own pulse. He walked along the ridge for what felt like an eternity, perhaps another hour and a half, sweat stinging his eyes and evaporating instantly on his sun-blasted skin. He kept his gaze glued to the ground, searching not for metal, but for disruption. The key had been found in a small depression. Logic dictated the corresponding structure might be hidden in a similar sinkhole. a place where the sand had settled and then been stabilized by the object beneath. The psychological toll began to manifest in a deep, burning ache behind his eyes. The environment was designed to break concentration, to force surrender. But Elias forced his focus, driven by the incomprehensible promise held within the key. Then, about 50 yards ahead, the ridgeline broke. Not eroded naturally, but seemingly interrupted by a massive oval shape beneath the sand. The fine dust was thinner here, replaced by coarser grey-white gypsum flakes that seemed slightly elevated, forming a low, massive hump. He approached cautiously, every muscle tense. The heat here seemed slightly different, radiating upward not just from the sun-baked sand, but from the object itself. A dense, oppressive warmth that spoke of trapped millennia. Elias dropped to his knees again, ignoring the searing pain. This was it. The shape was too defined, too large to be a natural formation. It was roughly circular, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, slightly convex, and utterly immobile. He had no tools, only his hands, strengthened by years of ceaseless, necessary labor and the unwavering urgency generated by the key pressed against his chest. He started digging with desperate fury. The initial layer of sand was easy, light, airy, and easily tossed aside. But beneath the top 2 feet, the material changed dramatically. It became packed, almost cemented by residual moisture and the weight of eons. It was heavy, gritty, and fiercely resistant. He worked in short, gasping bursts. Each scoop of sand required a focused, agonizing effort. The muscle fibers in his arms screamed, contracting into tight, painful knots. The lack of water was now a critical threat. His mouth was bone-dry, and the edges of his vision began to blur slightly with the onset of heat exhaustion. The dramatic intensity of the situation was magnified by the sheer solitude. If he collapsed here, the desert would absorb him without a ripple, leaving no trace. This fear was not paralyzing but galvanizing. He had to know what the key unlocked, even if the effort cost him the last reserves of his strength. He dug for 30 minutes, a lifetime of concentrated effort. He had cleared a circumference of perhaps 4 feet, revealing the edge of the object. It was metallic, dark, and smoothed by unimaginable friction, but not polished. He had found the door. It was not a vertical door set into a wall, but a massive circular hatch laid horizontally into the earth, flush with the ancient geological stratum below the sand. The metal was matte black, deeply pitted, and yet structurally perfect. It looked like the lid of a sealed vault, an eye closed beneath the eyelid of the desert. He scraped the sand away from the circumference, following the massive seam where the door met the surrounding earth. The diameter was even larger than he first estimated, closer to 10 feet. It was impossible, monumental, existing in a landscape where nothing of such permanence should survive. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Whatever was sealed beneath this door was meant to be protected from everything. Time, erosion, discovery. The sun beat on his back like a brass gong. He paused, leaning his weight onto his hands, his head swimming. He needed to find the mechanism. He crawled along the perimeter, wiping sweat and grit from his eyes. About a quarter of the way around the exposed edge, his searching fingers found an indentation, a break in the seamless metal skin. It was the lock mechanism. It was not a keyhole in the traditional sense. It was a deep, complex recess, a negative image that perfectly mirrored the elaborate, multi-layered teeth and spirals of the key he carried. The dark metal of the lock assembly was pristine, shielded from the elements. A profound sense of inevitability settled over Elias. This moment, this specific conjunction of objects and location, felt preordained, too meticulously aligned to be accidental luck. With trembling, exhausted movements, he pulled the heavy hematite key from his pocket. The metal felt impossibly charged now, vibrating faintly in his hand, as if recognizing its partner. He knelt directly before the lock, the position of his body awkward and painful. He held the key poised above the dark recess, his breath hitching in his chest. His heart hammered a brutal, deafening rhythm against his ribs. The consequence of this action felt infinite. What if this door was a grave marker? What if it released something dangerous, poisonous, or entirely terrifying? His mind screamed these warnings, but the driving, desperate need for connection and understanding, the true hunger of the orphan, silenced them. He carefully aligned the key. The complexity of the bit required absolute precision. He guided the spiraling handle, the serrations finding their corresponding slots with a soft, metallic snick. The key slid fully home. It fit perfectly, seamlessly. The weight of the world seemed to shift onto his shoulders. Elias paused again, his thumb resting on the cold, curved grip. He felt an intense, irrational fear of turning it, of initiating a change that could never be undone. But the key demanded action. He wrapped his fingers around the handle and began to rotate it clockwise. The movement was surprisingly smooth, requiring only moderate effort, suggesting that the inner mechanisms, whatever they were, had been preserved in perfect working order. The sound was the most startling thing. A deep, profound clunk that vibrated through the earth and into his bones, followed by a sequence of highly resonant, high-pitched metallic clicks that echoed the complexity of the key itself. Click, click, whir, clank. When the turning stopped, the key remained locked in place. The surface of the door, however, began to react. It did not immediately lift. Instead, faint, nearly invisible lines of light began to trace themselves across the matte black surface, radiating outward from the central lock assembly like the veins of a leaf. The light was a strange, deep sapphire blue, almost liquid in its intensity. The light pulsed, growing brighter, illuminating the small well of sand Elias had dug out. The intense drama of the display held him rigid, utterly mesmerized. He forgot the heat, the thirst, the aching hunger. The light reached the perimeter of the door, tracing the seam. A sudden, massive internal grinding sound began, the sound of immense metal moving against immense pressure. It was slow, deliberate, a sound of history being unsealed. The circular hatch did not fly open. It rose with agonizing slowness, powered by hydraulics or mechanisms far beyond Elias's comprehension, issuing a long, metallic groan of protest against its long interment. As the door lifted, a wave of cool, inert air rushed out, carrying with it a scent that was utterly foreign to the desert, the smell of ozone, dry paper, and silence. It was the smell of a forgotten library. Elias scrambled backward, falling onto the hot sand, shielding his eyes from the intensity of the light now spilling from the aperture. The door rose perhaps 3 feet, then stopped, resting on unseen supports. It revealed a perfectly square opening into the earth, a dark, velvet void framed by the brilliant sapphire tracing lines. He crawled to the edge and peered in. The shaft was deep, perhaps 20 feet, lined with the same dark, seamless metal. A set of shallow, non-slip steps, also metallic, led downward into the darkness. But the darkness was not complete. At the bottom of the shaft, filtering up faintly, was a soft, steady, white light. The air that rose from the depth was cool, dry, and pure. It felt like drinking filtered water. Elias had found the door. Now he had to confront the everything. The gravity of the choice was immediate and suffocating. He was 12 feet below the sun, already committed. He gripped the edge of the opening, swinging his legs over the lip. The steps were designed for easy descent, wide enough for both his small feet. The moment his weight settled on the first step, the sapphire light tracing the rim of the door dimmed, replaced by a warm, steady amber light that illuminated the stairs without casting harsh shadows. He descended slowly, testing each step. The silence below was overwhelming. It was an absence of sound so complete that he could hear the faint, high-pitched ringing in his own ears, a residue of the desert's constant noise. 20 steps down, his feet touched a floor made of the same cool, matte metal. He was standing in a small square anteroom. The walls were smooth, seamless, and absorbed light rather than reflected it. In the center of the room, positioned directly beneath the open shaft, was a pedestal carved from dark, polished stone, a material alien to Ashkalan. Resting on the pedestal, perfectly illuminated by the ambient white light that permeated the space, was the source of the everything. It was a single object, yet it contained multitudes. It was not a crown, not a gem, and not a map to gold. It was a repository. The object was a cube, about a foot on each side, made of a translucent, smoky, quartz-like material. Inside the cube, suspended in the physical center, was a complex, slow-moving swirl of light, not electrical, but purely informational. It looked like condensed memory. Elias approached the pedestal, drawn by an irresistible curiosity that dwarfed his earlier fear. He reached out and touched the cool, smooth surface of the smoky cube. The moment his fingers made contact, the ambient white light in the room intensified, shifting from mere illumination to an active conduit. The light seemed to move through the stone, through the floor, and directly into Elias's hand. It was not a shock, but a flooding, immediate and overwhelming, of sensory and emotional data. The data was not delivered as words, but as instantaneous, fully formed perceptions, rushing into the vacuum of his mind. He saw the desert, but not as the desolate ruin he knew. He saw it centuries ago, lush and green, traversed by flowing rivers and towering unfamiliar structures built of shimmering white stone. He saw people, his ancestors, living in harmony with the extreme environment, not fighting it. Their faces were clear, their joy palpable, transmitted as pure warmth. The influx of information was too fast, too potent. His knees buckled, and he sank down onto the cool floor, gripping the pedestal for support. The sheer volume of received truth was painful, stretching the limits of his young consciousness. Then the focus narrowed, concentrating the stream of information onto a specific memory, a specific truth. He saw two figures, a man and a woman. Their faces were startlingly familiar. The angle of the jaw, the curve of the eyebrow, the faint laugh lines around the eyes. His mother, his father. The everything was not about global power or lost civilizations, but about his own devastatingly immediate personal loss. He saw them, not as ghosts or faded memories, but vibrant, alive, standing in this very room centuries before, or perhaps just moments before, the tragedy that claimed them. They were speaking, their voices inaudible, but their intention was transmitted directly into Elias's emotional center, profound, sacrificial love. They had not abandoned him. They had not died arbitrarily. The rush of memory revealed that Elias's parents were the last true custodians of this subterranean repository, guardians of the ancient knowledge that predated the desert's current devastation. They were scientists, philosophers, keepers of the true history of Ashkalan. The emotional weight of this revelation was crushing. Elias had spent his entire conscious life burdened by the silent accusation of abandonment, surviving on the scraps of strangers' pity. Now he understood the context of their absence. He witnessed, through the cube, the final moments before the sealing of the door. An inevitable catastrophe, not geological but environmental, was about to engulf the remaining settlements. An accelerated desertification brought on by a long-forgotten misuse of water resources. His parents, knowing they could not survive the immediate onset, had calculated one last, desperate chance for their legacy. They had prepared the key, designed to be found only when the environmental pressure reached a certain level. They had chosen this method of preservation, not to save themselves, but to save the knowledge and to leave him a legacy far greater than simple gold. The cube transmitted their final, agonizing choice. They had sealed themselves in a temporary stasis field adjacent to the information repository, designed to preserve them until the moment the door was opened by the rightful heir, Elias. They were not dead. They were waiting. The emotional impact shattered Elias's remaining composure. A wave of gut-wrenching grief and relief washed over him. He cried out, a raw, choking sound that resonated violently in the silent chamber, his small body convulsing with the force of years of suppressed pain, finally finding an outlet. Tears streamed down his grimy cheeks, mixing with the dust and sweat. He was not alone. He was a prince of a forgotten truth, the inheritor of a sacred trust. The flow of information eased, leaving him exhausted, emotionally raw, but utterly whole. The cube pulsed again, and the ambient white light shifted to a warm, gentle gold. On the wall opposite the pedestal, a faint outline appeared, resolving itself into another metallic door, smaller and less intricate than the massive exterior hatch. A small, melodic chime, soft as crystal, echoed in the room. The new door was not locked. It was waiting. Elias, unsteady but propelled by a fierce, undeniable need, rose to his feet. His exhaustion was forgotten. His hunger was trivial. He had a singular, immediate purpose. He walked across the small anteroom, his steps now imbued with a dignity he hadn't possessed moments before. He placed his hand on the handle of the inner door, a simple, vertical bar of cool, polished brass. He pulled. The inner chamber was immediately brighter, warmer, and filled with a gentle, humming sound. It was slightly larger than the anteroom, but its architecture was simpler. In the center of this room, enclosed in separate, transparent casings that glowed with a faint internal light, were the stasis units. Two figures lay within, resting peacefully, seemingly merely asleep. His father, whose features were now crystal clear in Elias's memory, the strong brow, the determined mouth, and his mother, her long dark hair spread out beneath her head like silk on the metal pillow. The faint, comforting mole above her left eye, identical to the one Elias carried. They were in perfect stillness, utterly preserved, waiting for the trigger of the key. Elias approached the first unit, that of his mother. He pressed his hand against the transparent surface. It was cool and firm. He could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm maintained by the ancient, complex technology. The sudden, intense urgency of the dramatic moment returned, sharp and overwhelming. He had the key. He had the truth. He had found everything. Now he had to use the final piece of knowledge transferred from the cube. The cube had revealed that the stasis field required a specific timed sequence of energy release, controlled by the original hematite key, now resting in the exterior lock. Elias ran back through the anteroom, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He looked up at the open shaft leading to the cruel, relentless sun above. The aperture seemed infinitely far away, but the threat of the desert was secondary to the urgency of his mission. He reached the key still secured in the massive exterior lock. He had to perform the sequence precisely as shown in the overwhelming burst of information. One rotation too fast or too slow, and the delicate equilibrium of the stasis field would be compromised. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to slow his panicked pulse. His hands, though still gritty with sand, were steady now, driven by a transcendent focus. The sequence required 2 counterclockwise turns, a pause of exactly 5 seconds, followed by a final full clockwise turn to the lock's original closed position. Elias began the motion. He turned the heavy key counterclockwise. The complex mechanical clanking resumed, less demanding now, more like a precision instrument performing a required function. The amber light in the shaft flickered once. 1 turn. He released the pressure and immediately turned it again. Clank, whir, click. 2 turns. He pulled his hand back instantly, forcing himself into motionless waiting. The silence that followed was torturous, magnified by the intense internal clock ticking in his head. 1 second, 2 seconds. Every nerve ending screamed for him to rush, but the transmitted knowledge warned of catastrophe. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. On the exact 5th second, measured by the internal resonance he felt, he grasped the key again and initiated the final full clockwise rotation. The key turned smoothly, returning to its locked vertical position. Clunk-snick. The lock was sealed. In the chamber below, the effect was immediate and profound. The low, steady hum intensified into a high-pitched, sustained tone that filled both rooms, resonating within Elias's teeth and skull. The amber light faded entirely. Simultaneously, the 2 stasis units began to glow intensely from within. The translucent casing of the quartz cube began to vibrate slightly. Elias ran back into the inner chamber, desperate to witness the outcome, his breath catching in his throat. The light emanating from the stasis units swelled, reaching a brilliant, almost painful white. Then, with a sound like escaping steam, the intense white dissolved and the units dimmed, leaving the transparent casings merely transparent. The high-pitched hum ceased. The silence returned, heavy and expectant. Elias approached his mother's unit first, his legs shaking violently. He could now see her clearly, no longer bathed in the preservation light. She looked exactly as she had in the memory, vibrant and whole. A soft, shallow cough broke the silence. His mother's eyelids fluttered. Slowly, reluctantly, they opened. Her eyes, the same warm brown as his own, looked directly at him. They were clear, but held the profound confusion of someone waking from a sleep of centuries. She blinked several times, her gaze drifting around the chamber, then settling back on the small, dust-caked face peering through the glass. A soft, bewildered whisper escaped her lips, audible through the metallic stillness of the room. It was his name. Elias? The sound of his name, spoken by her voice, after a lifetime of silence, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He choked on a sob, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Before he could respond, the other unit gave a deeper, more resonant sound, the clearing of a throat. His father was stirring. He sat up slowly, looking intensely at the surroundings, his scientific mind immediately assessing the situation. Even before the emotional recognition, he saw Elias, kneeling before his mother's unit, weeping openly. The look of confusion on his father's face morphed instantly into one of agonizing, overwhelming relief and sorrow, understanding the vast gulf of time that must have passed. Elias's mother reached up, her hand pressing against the inside of the glass where Elias's face rested. Her touch was absent, but her intention was absolute. His father reached out and pressed a sequence of concealed buttons along the side of the stasis unit. A soft, pressurized hiss indicated the seal was being broken. The glass casing of his mother's unit retracted silently into the floor. She was free. She sat on the edge of the unit for a moment, gathering her bearings, the scent of fresh, pure life instantly overlaying the smells of ozone and metal. Then she looked down at her son, her eyes wide, glistening with tears that had been held in check for millennia. She slid off the platform and knelt, embracing him with a fierce, absolute strength that belied her long sleep. Elias was crushed against her, inhaling the scent of her skin and hair, a scent he had known only through the fragmented memories of early childhood, now real, tangible, and overwhelming. The dramatic intensity of the moment culminated not in shouting or grand pronouncements, but in the desperate, quiet sound of a child finally safe, finally home. "Mama," he whispered, the word thick with years of denial and longing. "My son." "My little key," she murmured into his hair, gripping him so tightly he felt the faint, comforting beat of her heart against his own starved chest. You found the door. You found everything. Behind them, Elias's father stepped out of his own unit, moving with a weary grace. He approached them slowly, his eyes fixed on his son. He placed a steady, massive hand on the back of Elias's head, a gesture of ownership and protection that was the most profound object Elias had ever encountered. "You endured, Elias," his father said, his voice deep and slightly rough from disuse. "You were strong enough to wait for the truth." The three figures remained locked in that embrace for a long time, grounded by the cold, ancient metal floor of the repository, surrounded by the silence of recovered history. The everything was not the knowledge of the past or the technology of stasis. It was the absolute, undeniable truth of his origin, the connection severed by catastrophe, now violently, beautifully restored. Elias slowly pulled away, wiping the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked up at his parents, truly seeing them for the first time, not as idealized ghosts, but as vulnerable, complex people who had sacrificed their present for his future. He looked around the small, silent chamber, noting the detail of the seamless walls, the complex technology that had waited for him. The true meaning of the key now resonated perfectly within him. It was not merely a mechanism for opening a vault. It was a physical manifestation of his inheritance, a tangible link between the past and his sudden, brilliant future. The desert above was still a crucible of light and dust, demanding life. But down here, shielded by the massive sealed door, Elias had found the center of his own universe, resolving the relentless, existential urgency of the orphan into the profound, quiet peace of a loved, recognized son. The knowledge was contained, the family was whole, and the vast aching emptiness of his past was instantly, irrevocably filled.